Hi everyone, my name is Carrie and today I'll be talking about C++ classes. To start off, I'll be briefly talking about why we need C++ classes in the first place. So in any introductory programming class that you might have taken, whether here at Michigan or outside, you've definitely have learned about primitive data types. So that includes integers, strings, bools, and doubles. But let's just say you want to encapsulate all that information into one object. That is exactly where classes comes in, as classes enable you to kind of incorporate all of that information into one object. So that information could include member variables, member functions, or the constructor, which we will be going over later on. And to start with some key definitions, classes are essentially a user-defined type that contains member functions and member variables, whereas objects are an instance of that specific class. So to kind of illustrate that and make it more clear, I've created an analogy to kind of illustrate that point. So let's just say there's a blueprint of a house. That blueprint is essentially what a class is, as it serves as a template to create other objects, or in our specific analogy, other houses. Now moving on to the specific C++ syntax. As you can see here, we have the class keyword, which is used to create a class, as well as the name of the class, which you want to use to create. So in our case, we want to create a class student, so we put it as student right here. And also in C++, it is important to note that all the elements within a class are default private, which essentially means that if a user wants to access those elements, they're not able to do it because basically C++ classes are default private and can't access any private elements. However, if you want to allow the users to be able to access those elements, then you can use the public keyword in order to allow the user to access it outside of the class. And to kind of illustrate the difference between public and private, I've created examples of both public and private member variables to kind of illustrate that point. However, it is also important to note that usually when we're coding, we don't use public member variables because we don't want the user to be able to modify or access those member variables. And that is where getters and setters comes in, which we'll be discussing later on. But to start off, let me create another kind of brief analogy to illustrate this point. So let's just say that our user is like a teacher. And let's say the teacher wants to access a student's social security number. They shouldn't be able to do that because a social security number is private information and therefore should be stored as private. And as a result, this is kind of why in the student class, this social security number integer is private. However, see, let's just say that the teacher wants to access something public, like a public information. For example, class standing. Well, if the user, or like the teacher in our example, wants to access class standing, they're able to do that because it's considered public and under the public keyword. So moving on to getters and setters that I mentioned previously. So let's just say that the programmer wants to allow the user to be able to return or get the value of that private member variable that they can access from outside of the class. So a getter essentially enables that user to do that. And one thing important to note is that the return type of the getter function has to match the type of that member variable. So in our case, the member variable that we're trying to return is social security number, and that is of type int. And so as a result, the getter function that we're using has to have a return type of integer. And within the body of the getter itself, it's only a one-line function, and all you have to do is return the value of that private member variable. And essentially, that's the getter function. Moving on to the setter function. The setter function is what essentially enables the user to be able to set the value of a private member variable to whatever that user wants it to be. And one thing to note here is that the return type is void, as essentially you're not returning anything, and all you have to do is assign whatever you're trying to input as the private member variable. Now moving on to constructors. Let's say you want to create specific instances or objects of that class. This is where constructors come in. And usually in C++, they implicitly create constructors, default constructors for you so that you don't have to actually explicitly define a constructor. However, let's just say you want to create a default constructor and explicitly define it. This here is an example of a default constructor. And in this default constructor, what you're doing is you're default initializing the private member variables social security number and class standing as these default values that you set. This other constructor here is what you use if you want the user to be able to preset these values and set them equal to whatever the user wants. So essentially this constructor here is taking in arguments of type int and type string, and basically sets the social security number and class standing valid inputs as the private member variable values in the class object itself. Now putting it all together, as you can see here, I created two objects of type student. And this first object of type student, carry, was default constructed using the default constructor. And as a result, if you remember from the previous slide, the default constructor sets social security number to 0. And then later on, when we see out the return value of the getter function, we should be returning 0 because it was default constructed. However, in this other example of a student object, Bob, essentially we used the other constructor which took in input arguments, and the input arguments here that we put in were 1324 for the social security number and sophomore for class standing. And essentially what the getter function should return here should be 1324, as that is what we default initialized in that constructor. And as you see the output here, it matches our previous observations and thus shows that our constructors successfully constructed these objects of type student. That's all for today. Thanks for listening.